fourth time, the United States of America are crowned champions of the world, and for the very first time they've done it on European soil. It is finished at the Stade de Lyon in the final, in victory and joy for the United States.
Hey everyone, welcome to Soccerpedia, the newest soccer podcast. I'm your host, Kai Uchimura, also known as Coach Kai. This is the second episode of this podcast. I'll try to post these podcasts in more online platforms like YouTube, and maybe eventually on iTunes and in the podcast app on your smartphones. I asked friends on Facebook about soccer topics for me to cover, and I received a few responses. For this episode, I will cover the topic of the pay between the U.S. men's national team compared to the U.S. women's national team. This topic of pay between the two teams has been subject to much debate in the past 5 years. I will do my best to cover the ins and outs of what is going on regarding the pay and salary issues that have been brought forth. Before getting into the details, this topic has been a hot button issue. First and foremost, I will say that I am not persuaded by those who argue men should be paid more for blank sport because the worst men's team would still defeat the best women's team. This is such a weak argument regarding pay. This is a talking point in various internet echo chambers. For this podcast, I'm not going to talk about salaries between the Major League Soccer, the MLS, and the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League. That can be a topic of another future podcast. For this episode, I'm here to talk about the legit structures of the pay gap debate regarding the men and women's national teams. Alright, let's take a rewind to a year ago. On March 8th, 2019, all 28 members of the U.S. women's team filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against the United States Soccer Federation regarding gender discrimination on the basis of pay, despite performing consistently well, having won back-to-back Women's World Cups in 2015 and 2019. The lawsuit also argues the team's success has, quote, translated into substantial revenue generation and profits, end quote, for U.S. Soccer Federation and, quote, during the period relevant to this case, the women's national team earned more in profit and/or revenue than the men's national team, end quote. The U.S. Soccer Federation has denied the claims in the women's lawsuit, arguing in a May 2019 court filing that the pay differential between the men and women's players is, quote, based on differences in aggregate revenue generated by the different teams and or any other factor other than sex, end quote. And that the two teams are, quote, physically and functionally separate organizations, end quote. There was even more controversy this past week when the U.S. Soccer Federation President Carlos Cordeiro resigned due to the court filings in that the U.S. Soccer Federation said, quote, female players have less physical ability and responsibility than the players on the men's national team. And so he immediately resigned and has since apologized for the statement. This court case and the lawsuit that was filed by the U.S. women's national team against the U.S. Soccer Federation is scheduled to go on trial May 5th in California. So, the smoking gun question is, are the U.S. women's national team players being paid less than the men? The short answer and the straight to the point answer is, the women are paid less sometimes. The way to go about and resolve this issue is complex and easier said than done, because the system in which the men and women's national team players are paid are different because they were structured and designed through separate collective bargaining agreements. Let's dig deep and analyze this. The first thing that people talk about regarding this topic of equal pay in women's soccer and women's sports in general is sponsorships, revenue, and profit of how each team does. All right, first, regarding sponsorships. According to the United States Soccer Federation's financial documents, in the 2018 fiscal year, the Federation had an operating revenue of slightly over $101 million. Sponsorships accounted for about half of the overall revenue, while about a fourth was brought in from national team games itself. Sponsorships grew nearly 50% between 2014 and 2015 fiscal years, and it is important to know that the 2014 World Cup was the last World Cup that the U.S. men's national team has participated in. They reached the round of 16 before being knocked out by Belgium. Sponsorships grew another 25% between fiscal years 2015 and 2016, when the women won the 2015 World Cup, and then it increased to around $45 million. Since 2016, the revenue has pretty much stayed the same. The overall increase in revenue through sponsorships cannot be attributed to either team because these kind of documents have not been released specifically by the U.S. Soccer Federation. Also, because the U.S. Soccer Federation sells sponsorships in a bundle to TV networks, currently you can see U.S. women and men's soccer teams on Fox, ESPN, and Univision. Those are the TV stations that own the rights to broadcast home matches for the national teams. This bundle to broadcast both teams includes sponsorships that makes it tough to distinguish which team brings in more sponsorships or how sponsorship dollars are allocated among the men and women's national teams. Now, let's dig into revenue on its own. According to the Wall Street Journal, through audited financial statements from the U.S. Soccer Federation, in 2016, women's games generated $1.5 million more in revenue than the men's games. From 2016 to 2018, women's games generated approximately $50.8 million in revenue compared to $49.9 million for the men's games. And it is important to know that the years 2016, 2017 did not include any, was an off World Cup year. And of course, the 2018 World Cup for the men, the U.S. men's national team did not qualify. So, continuing with the topic of revenue, with the U.S. women's national team winning the World Cup in 2019, Nike CEO Mark Parker said that the USA women's home jersey is the number one selling jersey either for men or women's team ever sold on Nike.com in one season, according to their Q4 earning report in 2019. For a long time, there was in fact a disparity between the revenue generated by the men and women, but within the past few years, that has disappeared. The women's team contributed close to more than half of the Federation's revenue from the games since fiscal year 2016. Overall, from fiscal year 2016 to 2018, the women's games generated about $900,000 more revenue than the men's game. It is important to note that between 2016 and 2018, the U.S. men's soccer team played 35 senior home games compared to the 52 home matches that the U.S. women's national team played in that time span. In the year following the 2015 World Cup win, women's games generated $1.5 million more than the men's game, as mentioned earlier. And in recent years, the men's revenue tally also included fees that opposing teams pay in order to play in the United States. It is important to know that for the most recent Women's World Cup cycle in 2019, the women's team is likely to have higher revenue since they won the World Cup compared to the men who failed to qualify for the 2018 World Cup in Russia. But when you're looking at game revenue, the U.S. Soccer Federation's own financial statements states that the women's team had held its own in comparison to the men's team since fiscal year 2016. Which brings to the next point, which is the profit. The complete gross revenue is not the end-all be-all for everything. You have to take a look at the expenses as well. In order to determine the profit, organizing games are not free. It takes a lot of time and effort, and of course the players themselves have to get paid. It is important to know that the U.S. Soccer Federation does not always receive a profit for each game, depending on the attendance and other factors. With that being said, when you look at the fiscal years of 2016 and 2017, which were non-World Cup years, the women's team generated $9 million more, or generated $9 million in total profit, while the men's team in fiscal 2015 and 2016, also non-World Cup years, had a net revenue of slightly over $3 million. So that's a $6 million difference between the two teams. The U.S. women's national team has had better ratings in the past few years than the men. The 2019 Women's World Cup final produced higher ratings in the U.S. compared to the 2018 World Cup final in the U.S. So apparently Americans rather watch their women's team winning the men's apparently Americans rather watch their women's team winning than the men's team not being present at all. With the U.S. women's national team bringing in more profit and revenue and better ratings, why are they being paid less? Like I mentioned earlier towards the beginning of the podcast, it's hard to make a comparison of the earnings for men and women's players because the two teams have different collective bargaining agreements that details the different pay structures. Let's go over them. A contract player on the women's national team makes a base salary of $100,000 a year, according to their most recent collective bargaining agreement, and can earn performance-based bonuses depending on the result of the game and the strength of the opponent. And the current CBA collective bargaining agreement was approved by the Women's Labor Soccer Union in April of 2017. So, for example, a U.S. women's national team player earns $8,500 per friendly win against a top 4 team, including Canada. $6,500 per friendly win against teams ranked 5th through 8th in FIFA World Rankings, and they would win $5,250 per friendly win against a team outside of the top 8 ranked teams. For a tie, a player on the women's national team would receive $1,750 against a top 4 team, but would earn $0 for any team outside of the top 4 in a tie, or they would receive no money for a loss. It is important to know that players without a contract have a different pay schedule. Now, on the men's national team, players earn only bonuses, so there is no automatic base salary. A friendly win for the men against a top-ranked side, including Mexico, a player would earn $17,625. A friendly win against any team outside the top 10, they would earn $6,250. A tie against a top-ranked team, including Mexico, they would earn $8,125. A tie outside of the top 10 ranked teams earned $6,250. A loss regardless of the strength of opponent, a U.S. men's national team player would earn $5,000. So, each player on the U.S. men's national team is guaranteed at least $5,000 per senior friendly match. This part gets tricky, and it ties in with the lawsuit between the U.S. women's national team and the United States Soccer Federation. The lawsuit alleges that under the previous collective bargaining agreement that ended in December of 2016, in a hypothetical 20-game scenario, a typical U.S. women's national team player would earn only 38% of what a typical U.S. men's national team player would make. Under the new and current CBA that ends in 2021, the percentage gap has closed in, so that the same scenario, a U.S. women's national team player would make 89% of what a U.S. men's national team player would make in that same situation. And the only true equality is that if both teams lose all 20 games in a year, both players would make $100,000 due to the automatic base salary of $100,000 for a U.S. women's national team player and a 5,000 game bonus per loss for a U.S. men's national team player. But this was part of the new and current CBA that the U.S. women's national team agreed to. Is it better than the previous one? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But this is the CBA that the U.S. women's national team agreed to, and it is in place till 2021. And they said it was the best agreement that they felt they could get without going on a strike. According to Sports Illustrated writer and University of New Hampshire law professor Michael McCann, quote, "The players' unions negotiated these systems. This type of argument thus implicitly directs the U.S. women's national team players to blame their own union for negotiating a system that pays them in ways they find unacceptable," end quote. Part of the lawsuit filed by U.S. women's national team is regarding World Cup bonuses. This is where, in my opinion, their argument to sue the U.S. Soccer Federation is going to be very weak, and I do not see them winning this case. Don't get me wrong, there is a huge pay disparity between the men and women when it comes to the World Cup, but that is FIFA's tournament, not the U.S. Soccer Federation's decision on the money prizes. Remember, FIFA sets the amount and awards any prize money to the winning country's federation. The federation, in this case, the United States Soccer Federation, then distributes the money to the players based on each team's collective bargaining agreement. So, total prize money for the Women's World Cup in 2019, all in all, was $30 million. Of course, that would be divided up, and the champions of that tournament would walk away with $4 million, which the U.S. women's national team won. Compare that to the 2018 Men's World Cup in Russia. The champions won $38 million, which is more than the entire pool for the Women's World Cup. And the total pool for the Men's World Cup in 2018 was $400 million. In other words, the champions from the Men's World Cup were awarded more than the total prize money than the women's tournament. So there's no question that there's a huge gap money here. But when it comes to U.S. women's national team lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation based on a FIFA tournament, which is a totally separate body of soccer, they do not have much of a leg to stand on. U.S. women's national team should have sued FIFA instead. But in all honesty, FIFA doesn't care about bad public relations the way the U.S. Federation may care. Also, when it comes to revenue generated around the world, the Men's World Cup final in 2018 generated 1.12 billion views. Compare that to the 2019 Women's World Cup final of 260 million viewers. That is undoubtedly a key reason why, from FIFA's point of view, is that they place a larger sum of winnings to the men's teams compared to the women's teams. Remember, equality and equity is not all about pay. Here is a U.S. women's national team star player Megan Rapinoe's take.
I think pay equity, a lot of times it just goes to compensation or salaries or bonuses, but it's really hard to have that conversation without really having the conversation about are the staffs funded equally? Are the youth teams funded equally? Branding, promotion, sponsorships.
So, without a doubt, Megan Rapinoe brings a good point, and women's soccer deserves equality across the board when it comes to funding for trainers, facilities. That is, without a doubt, that should be the automatic as far as equality. So, let's return back to the domestics here. When it comes to revenue from games, the women's national soccer team has held its own against the men's team since the 2015 World Cup. But remember, games account for only 1/4 of the U.S. Soccer Federation's revenue. Sponsorships make up half, and it's tough to figure out what the women's team contributed to the United States Soccer Federation without more information. So, are the women's players paid less? Like I said, sometimes. The U.S. women's national team has had to consistently produce championship results in the grandest of arenas of them all, and have sustained a larger winning percentage than the men's team in order to occasionally earn maybe slightly more to equal to the men. Even with those achievements, for the U.S. women's soccer players to earn exactly the same as the men's players is frankly impossible with the current collective bargaining agreements. And there's no question about it that there is a huge disparities and gaps in the World Cup bonuses. But like I said, that is a FIFA tournament and not something that the U.S. Soccer Federation itself has any control over for FIFA's bonuses. So it'll be very interesting to see how the lawsuit will play out in May in California. But that was my take on the U.S. Pay gap between the men's and women's national team players. Hope you guys enjoyed this podcast, and until next time.